We tried just one night apart. He moved out and took everything. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd end up confessing something like this, but here I am, spilling my guts to a bunch of strangers on the internet. I don't know why I'm doing it, but maybe it's because I've been carrying this thing around inside me, and it's gotten too heavy. Or maybe I just want someone to tell me I'm not the absolute worst person in the world, though deep down I know I probably am. Okay, so here goes. I always liked the loose kind of life. You know, the kind where you don't have to answer to anyone, and you can do whatever you want. I liked to go out late and party and flirt with people. It wasn't even about wanting someone else. It was just fun to get all dressed up and have people notice me. I liked the attention. I liked the freedom. When I met my husband, things started to change. Well, sort of. He was so different from the people I was used to. He was calm and steady and serious in a way that made me feel like he could anchor me, like he could be this solid rock in my crazy, messy life. I fell for him because of that. He was the kind of person who made you feel safe, like nothing could go wrong when he was around. We got married pretty quickly. I guess part of me thought that marrying him would fix all the things I didn't like about myself. I thought it would make me grow up and settle down and be this better version of me, someone who didn't need all the parties and the attention. I really believed that. At least I wanted to believe it. For a while things were good. I tried to be the kind of wife I thought he deserved. I stayed home, and I didn't go out, and I tried to be loyal. I cooked dinners, and I did the laundry, and I tried to keep things nice and normal. But it was hard. It was so hard. The thing is, I still missed the life I had before. I missed the excitement of it. I missed the way it made me feel alive, like every night was an adventure and anything could happen. And being married started to feel kind of boring. I know that sounds terrible, but it's true. It was like this big part of me had been locked away, and I didn't know how to live without it. Then about a year into the marriage, things started to get rocky between us. We argued a lot, and it felt like we couldn't see eye to eye on anything anymore. He'd say I wasn't trying hard enough, and I'd say he was too controlling. The fights would go round, and nothing ever got solved. That's when I started talking to this guy at work. He wasn't anything special, not really, but he was easy to talk to. He made me laugh, and he listened to me in a way my husband didn't seem to anymore. At first, it was just casual. We'd chat during lunch breaks or when we were working on the same project. It felt harmless, just two people getting along. But then I started telling him about my marriage. I told him about the fights and how unhappy I was, and how I felt like my husband didn't understand me. And he listened. He really listened. And I don't know, it just felt so good to have someone on my side, someone who seemed to get what I was going through. I woke up that morning feeling groggy. My head hurt and my mouth was dry. I had stayed out too late the night before, way too late, and I knew it. I wasn't even doing anything crazy, just drinks with some coworkers, laughing and talking until I lost track of time. When I looked at the clock on my phone and saw how late it was, I knew he'd be mad. But I didn't rush home. I stayed a little longer, telling myself I deserved to have a little fun. When I finally got home, the house was dark and quiet. He was already in bed. I slipped off my shoes and tiptoed inside, hoping not to wake him. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I told myself he'd get over it. After all, I was an adult. I could stay out late if I wanted to. But the next morning I could feel his anger the second I walked into the kitchen. He was sitting there drinking his coffee, and he barely looked at me. The air between us felt heavy, and I knew what was coming. I didn't want to deal with it. I didn't want to hear him say the same things he always said when we fought. He'd say I wasn't acting like a wife. He'd say I didn't care about him. He'd say I was selfish. And maybe he was right, but I didn't want to hear it. So when he started talking, I didn't apologize. I didn't say I was sorry for staying out late and worrying him. Instead, I told him he needed to stop acting like my boss or my father. I told him I wasn't a child, and he didn't have the right to control me. And the more he talked, the angrier I got. He was mad because I didn't call him, but I didn't see why I had to. I didn't think it was such a big deal. He said he stayed up late waiting for me, worried something had happened, but I thought he was just being dramatic. He said he didn't understand why I didn't respect him enough to at least let him know where I was. But I told him he was being ridiculous, that I shouldn't have to check in like I was some kind of teenager with a curfew. It was like we were speaking two different languages. No matter what he said, I had a comeback. And the more we argued, the worse it got. I didn't even care about his feelings at that point. I just wanted to win the fight. Looking back, I can see how wrong I was, but at that moment I didn't care. I was too angry to think about how he felt. I was too wrapped up in my own frustration to see how much I was hurting him. After a while, he stopped arguing. He just sat there staring at his coffee, and I could tell he'd given up. I should have stopped then. I should have walked away, but I didn't. I kept going, saying things I knew would hurt him, things I didn't even mean. And when I finally ran out of things to say, I grabbed my bag and stormed out the door. I didn't look back. I didn't care how upset he was. I just wanted to get away from him, from the fight, from everything. When I got to work, I tried to act like everything was fine. I smiled at my coworkers and joked around like I always did, but inside I felt terrible. Not because I regretted what I said, but because I hated that we were fighting again. It felt like we couldn't go a week without arguing about something. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't even know if I wanted to fix it. Part of me felt like maybe we weren't meant to be together. Maybe I wasn't cut out to be a wife. Maybe I'd never be the kind of person he wanted me to be. But another part of me didn't want to give up. I didn't want to be the kind of person who ran away when things got hard. I wanted to believe we could work things out, that we could find a way to be happy again. So I told myself I'd try harder, I'd be better. I wouldn't stay out late again. I wouldn't let myself get so angry. I wouldn't say things I didn't mean. But even as I told myself those things, I knew they weren't true. I knew I wasn't ready to change. I wasn't ready to let go of the person I used to be. I wasn't ready to be the kind of wife he deserved. And deep down, I think I knew that if I kept going the way I was going to lose him. But I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to be the person he needed me to be. So I sat there at my desk, staring at my computer, trying to figure out what to do next. And for the first time, I realized I didn't have an answer. I didn't know how to fix my marriage. I didn't know how to fix myself. And that's when it hit me. Maybe I didn't want to. I sat at my desk that morning staring at the computer screen, but I wasn't working. My fingers rested on the keyboard and the little blinking cursor just sat there, waiting for me to type something. But I couldn't focus. My mind kept going back to the fight with my husband. I felt a knot in my stomach, but I didn't know if it was guilt or anger. Maybe it was both. I kept thinking about how he looked when I left the house. He was sitting there, staring at his coffee, looking tired and hurt. But instead of feeling bad for him, I felt annoyed. Why did he have to act like that? Why couldn't he just let me be? I wasn't doing anything wrong. At least that's what I kept telling myself. But even as I thought that, there was this little voice in my head that kept saying maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was the problem. But I didn't want to listen to that voice. I pushed it down and tried to focus on something else. That's when my colleague walked over to my desk. He was the one I always talked to when things got hard. He was nice, and he always seemed to know the right thing to say. He leaned against my desk, and when he asked me if I was okay, I felt like I was going to cry. I didn't, though. I just shook my head and told him everything. I told him about the fight that morning, and about how my husband was mad because I came home late. I told him how I felt like my husband didn't understand me and how I didn't think I was doing anything wrong, but he made me feel like I was. My colleague listened quietly, nodding and looking at me with this soft, understanding look. It made me feel better, like I wasn't alone, like someone was on my side. He didn't interrupt me or tell me I was overreacting. He just listened, and it was exactly what I needed. When I was done talking, he told me I shouldn't let my husband hold me back. He said I was like a bird, and I needed to spread my wings and fly. I don't know why, but those words stuck with me. They made me feel powerful, like maybe I wasn't the bad guy after all. Maybe I was just someone who needed more freedom. Then he smiled and said I needed to clear my mind. He said I couldn't spend the whole day feeling sad and stuck. I hesitated at first because I wasn't sure what he meant, but then he offered to take me out for lunch. Just a quick break to get away from the office and shake off the morning's bad vibes. I shouldn't have said yes. I knew that even as I nodded and grabbed my bag. I knew it wasn't a good idea, but I did it anyway. I told myself it was harmless. It was just lunch. We went to this nice restaurant a few blocks away. It wasn't fancy, but it was cozy. the kind of place where you could relax and forget about everything for a little while. I felt a little guilty as we sat down, but I told myself I deserved this. I deserved to feel good, even if it was just for an hour. We ordered food, and while we waited, we talked about work and life and everything in between. He made me laugh, and for the first time all day, I felt like I could breathe. I didn't have to think about the fight with my husband or the mess I'd made of things. I could just be in the moment, but even as I smiled and laughed, there was a tiny voice in the back of my head that kept whispering that this wasn't right, that I shouldn't be here, that I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. I tried to ignore it, but it wouldn't go away. And then, just as the food arrived, I thought about my husband sitting at home or at work, probably still upset, probably wondering if I was thinking about him at all. I wasn't, not really, and that thought hit me harder than I expected. But instead of getting up and leaving, I stayed. I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. I told myself it was just lunch. And as we started eating, I pushed all those thoughts away. After we finished eating, we sat there for a while just talking and laughing. It felt so easy and light, like none of the heavy stuff in my life mattered anymore. I didn't want to go back to work. I didn't want to sit at my desk and pretend like everything was fine when it wasn't. I didn't want to think about my husband or our fight that morning. I guess my colleague could tell how I was feeling because he leaned closer and suggested that we skip the rest of the day. I froze for a moment, not because I was shocked, but because I was tempted. That wasn't something my husband would ever ask me to do. He was the kind of person who always followed the rules, who did what he was supposed to do, no matter what. But my colleague wasn't like that. He was a risk taker. He didn't care about rules or what people thought. And I found this thrilling. I didn't even think twice before I said yes. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, like I was finally doing something for me, something that would make me happy. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. I told myself I deserved this, that it wasn't wrong to want a break, to want a little fun. He paid for lunch and we left the restaurant, walking side by side like we didn't have a care in the world. My heart was racing, not because I was scared, but because I felt alive. I felt free. We walked for a while, talking and laughing until we got to his place. It wasn't far from the office, just a few blocks away. When we got inside, he told me to make myself comfortable, so I sat down on the couch. It was soft and warm, and it felt so much better than my desk chair at work. He disappeared into another room for a moment, and when he came back, he had this look on his face, like he was completely focused on me. It made me feel special, like I was the only person in the world who mattered. He sat down next to me, close enough that our knees almost touched, and he asked me how I was feeling. I told him I was fine, but that wasn't entirely true. I felt a little nervous, but at the same time I felt excited. It was this strange mix of emotions that I couldn't quite explain. Then he reached out and touched my leg, gently at first, like he was testing the waters. I didn't stop him. I didn't even flinch. Instead, I let him keep going. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it was just a friendly gesture, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. He started massaging my legs, slow and firm, and it felt so good that I closed my eyes for a moment. I told myself I needed this, that it was helping me relax, that it was taking away all the stress I'd been carrying around. I didn't want to think about whether it was right or wrong. I just wanted to feel good. As he worked his hands over my legs, he told me I was a princess. He said I deserved to be treated like royalty, like someone who was special and important and worthy of being pampered. I knew he was saying these things to make me feel good, but they worked. They made me feel seen and appreciated in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. My husband had never done anything like this for me. He wasn't the kind of person who said things like that or made me feel like I was the center of his world. He loved me, I knew that, but he didn't show it in the same way. I tried not to think about him as I sat there, letting my colleague massage my legs and tell me all the things I wanted to hear. I tried not to think about how wrong it was or how hurt my husband would be if he knew. I just focused on the moment, on the way it felt to be cared for, even if it was by someone who wasn't my husband. And for the first time in a long time, I felt happy. After I left my colleague's house that day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. There was this feeling inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just excitement, it was this strange sense of power, like I was finally in control of my own happiness. It was like something new had been born in me, something that wanted more, something that craved the kind of attention and care I got from my colleague that day. The rest of the afternoon, I couldn't focus on anything. I didn't want to think about work or my husband or any of the things that usually sat heavy on my mind. All I could think about was how good it had felt to be treated like I mattered, to have someone focus on me for a change. When I finally got home that evening, the house was quiet. My husband was already there, sitting in the living room, scrolling on his phone. He looked up when I walked in, and there was this softness in his eyes, like he was trying to figure out if I was still mad about our fight that morning. He asked me how work was, and I gave him the coldest, shortest answer I could think of. I wasn't even mad at him anymore, not really, but I didn't feel like talking to him. I didn't feel like giving him the satisfaction of thinking everything was okay between us. To my surprise, he apologized. He told me he was sorry for the argument that morning, for getting upset about me coming home late. He said he didn't want us to fight, that he wanted us to be happy. I should have felt guilty. I should have looked at him and seen how much he cared, how hard he was trying to make things right. But instead, I felt annoyed. I felt like he was trying to smooth things over when he didn't even understand what I needed, what I wanted. The truth was, he wasn't the one who needed to apologize. I was. I was the one who stayed out late, the one who snapped at him, the one who kept shutting him out. But I didn't say any of that. I just nodded and told him it was okay, even though I didn't mean it. And then, out of nowhere, this stupid idea popped into my head. It wasn't something I'd ever thought about before, but it was like a spark that caught fire and wouldn't go out. I thought about how nice it would be to have the kind of freedom my colleague had talked about, to spread my wings and do what I wanted without feeling guilty or tied down. The idea was so ridiculous that I almost laughed at myself for thinking it. But once it was there, I couldn't get it out of my head. I didn't want to bring it up seriously, though. I wasn't that bold. So I decided to test the waters to see how my husband would react if I mentioned it casually. I went into the kitchen and started making dinner. It wasn't anything fancy, just something quick and easy. While I cooked, I thought about what I was going to say, how I was going to say it without making it seem like a big deal. When the food was ready, I called him to the table and we sat down to eat. He was quiet at first, like he wasn't sure if I was still upset. But as we ate, he started talking about his day, telling me about something funny that happened at work. I nodded and smiled, but I wasn't really listening. My mind was too busy turning over the idea I'd had, trying to figure out the best way to bring it up. Finally, I decided to just go for it. I waited for a pause in the conversation, and then, as casually as I could, I asked him what he thought about open marriages. There was a sudden pause after I asked him that. The room felt so quiet that I could hear the sound of his fork lightly tapping his plate. He didn't answer right away, and I could tell he was trying to process what I had just said. I looked at him from the corner of my eye, pretending like it wasn't a big deal, like I hadn't just thrown something huge into the middle of our dinner. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and cautious, like he didn't want to upset me. He asked why I was asking that. He didn't sound angry, just confused, maybe even a little worried. For a second, I felt my stomach drop, like I'd been caught doing something I shouldn't have. But instead of answering him honestly, I just shook my head and told him not to worry about it. I said it was nothing, just a random thought I had. Then I quickly changed the subject, talking about something boring and safe, like the weather or groceries. He didn't push me for more, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. He kept looking at me like he was trying to figure out what was really going on in my head. The rest of the evening felt awkward. We finished dinner, and I cleaned up the kitchen while he sat in the living room. We didn't talk much, and when it was time for bed, we barely said goodnight. As I lay there next to him, staring at the ceiling, I felt this strange mix of guilt and defiance. I knew I was the one who had made things weird between us, but I also felt like I had the right to want more, to want something different. A few days later, I found myself slipping even further. That morning I went to work like normal, but I couldn't stop thinking about my colleague. I thought about the way he made me feel, the way he looked at me like I was the most important person in the world. It was such a contrast to the way things were at home, where everything felt heavy and complicated. By the time lunch rolled around, I had already made up my mind. I told my boss I wasn't feeling well and that I needed to leave early. He didn't question it, and before I knew it, I was walking out of the office with my colleague by my side. We didn't talk much on the way to his house. I think we both knew why we were going there, even if we didn't say it out loud. When we got inside, he told me to take off my shoes and get comfortable. The house smelled like candles and something sweet, like vanilla or cinnamon. It felt warm and inviting, like a place where nothing bad could happen. He asked me if I wanted a massage, and I hesitated for a moment. I knew it wasn't a good idea, but I also knew I wanted it. I wanted to feel that same sense of care and attention I had felt the last time I was there. So I nodded, and he smiled like he already knew what my answer was going to be. He told me to lie down on the couch, and I did. I felt a little nervous at first, but the moment he started, all that tension melted away. His hands were strong and gentle, and he seemed to know exactly where to press and how hard. He suggested that I take my shirt off, which I did, telling myself that it was just a massage. As he worked his way across my shoulders and down my back, he told me he used to be a professional masseuse. He said he had his own business once, a small spa, but it went under a few years ago. I could hear a hint of sadness in his voice when he talked about it, but I didn't say anything. I just let him keep going, letting his hands do their thing. He massaged my legs, and without even asking me, he slipped my skirt off. I was surprised, but not angry. I sort of liked the spontaneity. He worked my body thoroughly, and it is safe to say that it was the best massage I had ever had. He didn't miss a single spot, and by the time he was done, I felt like I was floating. I didn't want to get up. I didn't want to leave that little bubble of peace and comfort he had created. But then something shifted. As he sat down next to me, his hand resting lightly on my leg, the air in the room changed. It felt heavier, more charged, like we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't come back from. We had an intimate moment. I don't know how it happened, or maybe I do, but I don't want to admit it. It felt natural and wrong all at the same time, like something I wanted and didn't want, like something I couldn't stop even if I tried. When it was over, I felt this wave of emotion crash over me. It wasn't happiness or satisfaction, it was something darker, something messier. I didn't know what to do or what to say, so I just started gathering my things. As I was about to leave, he stopped me. He looked at me with this soft, hopeful expression, like he was about to say something important. Then he asked me if I would be his girlfriend. For a moment, I just stood there staring at him, not knowing what to say. My mind was spinning, and I felt like I was being pulled in 1,000 different directions. I knew I should say no, that I should walk out the door and never come back. But a part of me wanted to say yes, wanted to keep feeling the way he made me feel. In the end, I didn't say anything. I just mumbled something about needing to go and walked out the door. On my way home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. My colleague's words were stuck in my head. He had called me a princess, told me I deserved to be treated like one, and then he asked me to be his girlfriend. It felt wrong, but it also felt good. It felt like someone finally saw me, finally appreciated me in a way my husband didn't anymore. By the time I got home, I had made up my mind. I didn't want to lose what I had with my colleague. I liked how he treated me, how he made me feel special, so I called him. My hands were shaking as I held the phone, but I forced myself to do it. When he answered, I told him that I accepted. I said I would be his girlfriend. He sounded happy, and that made me feel good, like I had made the right choice. But when I walked into the house, all that confidence started to fade. My husband was sitting on the couch, looking tired but calm, and I knew I had to say something. I couldn't keep living this double life. I had to find a way to make it all work, to have both my husband and the freedom I wanted. So I brought it up again. I told him we should consider trying an open marriage. This time, I didn't make it sound like a joke. I told him it could be a way for us to explore new things, to figure out what we really wanted. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, his face blank, like he was trying to decide if I was serious. I was scared he was going to yell or storm out. But then, to my surprise, he nodded. He said he was willing to try it, that we could give it a shot and see how it went. I couldn't believe it. I had been so worried he would be angry, but instead, he was calm. He even suggested that we both go out that night separately and see what it was like. He said the only rule was that we had to be honest with each other about everything. I felt a rush of relief and excitement. I told him everything, starting with the massages and the time I spent at my colleague's house. I expected him to be upset, but he wasn't. He just listened, nodding like he was taking it all in. It was strange, but I told myself it meant he was okay with it. That night, we got ready to go out. He said he was going to a club with some friends, and I told him I was going to my colleague's house. It felt weird to say it out loud, but he didn't seem bothered. He just smiled and told me to have fun. When I got to my colleague's house, I felt completely free. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty or sneaky. I felt like I was doing exactly what I wanted, and it was okay. We spent the night together, and it was intimate and exciting, just like I had imagined it would be. But when I came back home the next morning, everything was different. The house was empty. All the furniture, all the decorations, everything was gone. It was like he had never even lived there. Then I saw the voicemail on my phone. When I listened to it, my heart sank. He told me that I was an embarrassment, that he couldn't believe I would think he'd ever be open or agree to the idea of an open marriage. He said he couldn't stay married to someone like me, someone who didn't respect him or their relationship. The message ended, and I just stood there, staring at the empty room. For the first time, I realized what I had done, how far I had pushed things. I had wanted freedom, but now I was completely alone. Update. It has been 3 months since I came home to nothing, and I feel like my whole world has fallen apart. When I saw the empty house that day, it didn't hit me right away. I stood there thinking maybe it was a bad dream, or maybe there was some kind of mistake. But there was no mistake, and it wasn't a dream. My husband was gone, and he wasn't coming back. For the first couple of days, I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to stay in that empty house, but I didn't want to call anyone either. I didn't want people to know what had happened or to see how bad things had gotten. So I packed a bag and went to my colleague's house. At first, staying with him felt okay. He was kind, and he made me feel like I wasn't completely alone. We slept together, and he brought me food when I didn't feel like getting up. He told me things would get better, and I wanted to believe him. I really did. But after the first 2 weeks, everything started to change. We began arguing a lot. It was little things at first, like who would do the dishes or what to watch on TV. But then the fights got bigger and louder, and I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The problem wasn't him. The problem was me. I didn't want to admit it, but deep down I knew it. I had been selfish and careless. I had ruined my marriage, and now I was ruining this too. He told me I was too much to handle, that I brought drama everywhere I went. And he was right. One night, after another big fight, he told me I had to leave. He said he couldn't do this anymore, that he needed his space back. I begged him to let me stay, but he didn't change his mind. So I packed my bag again, and I left. I had nowhere else to go, so I went back to the house my husband and I used to share. It felt even emptier than before, like all the memories we had made there had been sucked out along with the furniture. I slept on the floor that night, staring at the ceiling and wondering how I had let things get so bad. A few weeks later, I got the papers. My husband had filed for divorce. I didn't think it would hurt as much as it did, but it felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. I wanted to call him, to beg him to take me back, but I knew it was too late. I had pushed him too far, and now there was no way to fix it. Work has been a nightmare too. Every day I have to see my colleague. Every time I pass him in the hallway or sit near him in meetings, I feel this mix of anger and shame. I can tell he feels awkward too. We don't talk anymore unless we have to, and even then it's short and tense. People at work have started noticing too. They whisper when they see us, and I know they're talking about me. I can feel their judgment, and it makes me want to crawl into a hole and never come out. I've started drinking more. At first, it was just a glass of wine after work to take the edge off, but now it's more than that. Some nights I drink until I can't feel anything anymore. It helps for a little while, but when I wake up the next morning, the pain is still there, and it's even worse. I'm depressed. I feel like I've lost everything, and it's all my fault. I regret how I treated my husband, how I took him for granted and pushed him away. He didn't deserve that. He was good to me, and I threw it all away for what? For some fleeting thrill that didn't mean anything in the end. Now I'm left with nothing but regret. If I could go back and do things differently, I would, but I can't. All I can do is sit here in this empty house, drinking and crying and wondering how I let my life fall apart.